The wind came first, a low moan across the plains that gathered itself into a shriek. Then came the dust. It was not the soft, brown dust of a Missouri farm, but a pale, gritty powder torn from the bones of the earth. A scouring wind that flayed the sky to a bruised, sepia gray. It tasted of alkali and distance, and it found its way through every seam and crack in the freight wagon where Clara Mae Thompson had hidden herself for the better part of 3 days. She lay curled in a nest of scratchy hay, her body a tight knot of cold and fear. The fine silk of her wedding dress, meant for a walk down a sun-dappled church aisle, was ripped at the hem and stained with mud and something that looked horribly like blood from a butchered hog she'd scrambled over in her flight. Her hands, raw and chapped, were tucked beneath her chin, the fingers stiff as twigs. She was a preacher's daughter, raised to be gentle and clean and obedient, and now she felt like none of those things. She felt like a stray dog, burrowed into the straw for a bit of warmth, waiting for the boot. The wagon lurched to a final, jarring stop. Muffled shouts cut through the howl of the wind. This was it, then, the end of the line, a town whose name she did not know, in a territory that felt like the surface of the moon. Wyoming. The word itself was sharp and brittle in her mind. Through a crack in the wagon's wooden slats, she saw a street that was hardly a street at all, just a wide ribbon of churned mud and dust, bracketed by a few raw timber buildings with false fronts that did little to hide their plainness. A trading post, a saloon with swinging doors that slapped erratically in the wind, and a livery stable. Men moved like ghosts through the swirling grit, their hats pulled low, their collars turned up against the sting of the sand. It was a place that looked like it had been clawed from the wilderness and was in constant danger of being reclaimed by it. There was no softness here, no mercy. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and the gray Wyoming street dissolved into the humid green of a Missouri morning just 1 week ago. It was the morning of her wedding. The air in her father's house was thick with the scent of boiled ham and her mother's fretful perfume. Clara stood behind the parlor door, her hand on the cool brass knob, smoothing the white silk of her dress. She was supposed to be walking in to greet her groom, Silas Croft, a man twice her age with a prosperous farm and hands that always seemed damp. Her father, the Reverend Jedediah Thompson, had assured her it was a fine match, a godly union that would settle the family's many pressing debts. God's will, he'd called it. But it was men's voices she heard through the door, low and confidential. The final payment is settled. Then, Reverend, Silas was saying, his voice unctuous and satisfied. $100 clears the ledger at the bank, and the deed to the south pasture is mine. As we agreed, her father's voice replied, thin and reedy. A man of honor, Silas, a man of God. You will find my Clara to be an obedient wife, biddable, and of course, untouched. She has been raised in righteousness. A thick, wet chuckle. Purity is a fine commodity. Reverend, worth the price, a strong back for the farm work and a warm body for the bed. That's all a man truly requires. The rest is just window dressing. The words were not a slap. They were a slow, cold poisoning. Commodity, price, payment. She was not a bride. She was livestock. A piece of property used to settle a debt her father had incurred through bad investments and a weakness for earthly comforts. All his sermons on righteousness and God's grace were just noise to cover the sound of him selling his own daughter. Something inside her, a small, quiet thing she had kept locked away for years, finally broke. She backed away from the door, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. She did not make a sound. She moved through the house like a phantom, out the back door, past the smokehouse, and into the dense woods that bordered their property. She ran with the condemnation of her father's voice echoing in her head, past the swamp where she tore the hem of her dress on a cypress knee, barefoot through the sucking mud until her feet were raw. She ran until she reached the railway line, and by some miracle of desperation, A slow-moving freight train was chugging west. She had hauled herself into an open wagon, burying herself in the hay, her breath coming in ragged, tearing sobs. She had not stopped moving since. The groan of the wagon door being dragged open snapped her back to the biting Wyoming present. A burly man with a beard the color of rust peered in. His eyes narrowed against the dust. "End of the line. Anything in here's got to come out." Clara pressed herself deeper into the hay, trying to will herself invisible. But the man's eyes found her. They widened, not with sympathy, but with a kind of crude curiosity. "Well now, what have we here? Looks like a half-drowned cat." He reached for her, but Clara scrambled away, tumbling out of the back of the wagon and landing hard in the dirt. The wind tore at her hair, whipping the loose strands across her face. She staggered to her feet and ran, her only thought to put distance between herself and the man. She fled toward the relative shelter of the livery stable, the only place that seemed to offer a reprieve from the wind and the prying eyes. She slipped inside, the air thick with the warm, animal smell of horses and manure. She found an empty stall and collapsed into the clean hay in the corner, pulling her torn dress tight around her shaking body. For a long while, there was only the sound of the storm and the soft shuffling of horses. She felt a profound, bottomless despair. She had escaped, but to what? A slow death from freezing in a town that looked like the edge of the world? Her father would have sent word by now. A runaway bride was a scandal, but a runaway daughter who had shamed a preacher was a target. The trading post across the street was a hive of quiet activity. Men came and went, their faces grim. It was inside, amidst the smells of cured leather, coffee beans, and chewing tobacco, that Elias Coulter stood at the counter. He was a tall man, built lean but with a width to his shoulders that spoke of hard, solitary labor. His face was all sharp angles, weathered by sun and wind, with a stillness about it that most people found unnerving. His eyes, a pale, clear gray, missed nothing. He did not speak unless he had to. He laid his purchases on the counter, a sack of flour, a block of salt, coffee, and 2 boxes of cartridges for his rifle. He paid in cash, his movements deliberate and efficient. As the storekeeper counted out the change, Elias's gaze drifted out the grimy window, toward the livery stable. He had seen the girl tumble from the wagon. He had seen the flash of white silk, so out of place in this world of brown and gray. He had seen her run. Now, through the stable doors, he could just make out a flicker of movement in the shadows. He saw her burrowing into the hay, her face turned away. There was a story there, and Elias had learned long ago that other people's stories were nothing but trouble. He collected his supplies and turned to leave. He was loading the sacks onto his pack mule when he heard the voices from the stable. They were rough, laced with a lazy cruelty. "Looky here, Jeb, a real lady, hiding in the hay." "Ain't no lady I ever seen," a second voice slurred. "Heard tell of a runaway from Missouri, preacher's girl, supposed to marry old man Croft. Notice says she's not in her right mind." Clara froze. 2 stable hands stood at the entrance to her stall, blocking the light. They were hulking figures, their faces smudged with dirt and stubble. The first one took a step closer, a smirk spreading across his face. "That you, little bird? That a wedding dress you're wearing?" He reached down and snagged a piece of the torn silk between a thumb and forefinger. "Fancy. Shame it's all ruined." "Leave me alone," Clara whispered, her voice trembling so badly she could hardly form the words. "We ain't gonna hurt you," the second one, Jeb, said with a low chuckle. "Just want to be neighborly. A girl like you shouldn't be all alone, especially one who's defiled." He said the word slowly, savoring it. The first man's smirk widened. "There's a reward, you know, but maybe we can come to a different kind of arrangement before we send word to your daddy." He lunged for her. Clara screamed, a thin, desperate sound that was swallowed by the wind. She scrambled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The man's hand closed around her arm. his grip like an iron band. And then a shadow fell over them. Both men looked up, their grins faltering. Elias Coulter stood there, silent as the grave. He had not made a sound as he approached. He simply filled the entrance to the stall, his height and breadth blocking out the world. His face was impassive, his gray eyes as cold and flat as river stones in winter. He did not look at the men. He looked at the grimy hand clamped on Clara's arm. "She said to leave her be," Elias said. His voice was not loud, but it had a low, gravelly timbre that vibrated in the small space. It was the sound of rocks grinding together. The man holding Clara hesitated, his bravado draining away. Everyone in this territory knew of Elias Coulter, the man who lived alone up in the high country, who kept to himself and was said to be faster with a gun than any man had a right to be. He was a ghost, a rumor, a man best left alone. "This ain't your concern, Coulter," the man blustered, though he did not tighten his grip. Elias still did not look at him. He took one slow step forward. He did not draw his weapon. He did not raise his fists. He simply moved, and his presence was a physical force, a promise of violence held in perfect, terrifying check. The air grew thick and heavy. "Let her go!" He said the words so quietly they were almost lost, but they carried an absolute finality. The stable hand's eyes widened. He looked from Elias's cold face to his partner, who had already taken a shuffling step back. He released Clara's arm as if it had burned him. Elias did not acknowledge them further. He looked at Clara, who was huddled in the hay, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a fragile, dawning hope. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the stable entrance. A silent command. "Go." Clara scrambled to her feet and fled past him, not daring to look back. The two stable hands melted away into the shadows of the livery. Elias watched them go, his expression unchanging. Then he turned and walked back out into the keening wind. He was cinching the last of the straps on his pack mule when she appeared at his side. The wind whipped her pale hair across her face and molded the tattered remnants of her dress to her thin frame. She was shivering, not just from the cold, but from shock. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Elias grunted, not looking at her. He finished his knot and straightened up, preparing to mount his horse. "Please," she said, her voice cracking with desperation. She took a step closer. "Please do not leave me here. They will find me. The whole town will know by nightfall." He finally turned to look at her, his gray eyes sweeping over her from head to foot. He saw the ruined dress, the bare, scratched feet stuffed into a pair of worn-out men's boots she must have stolen, the terror that swam in her deep blue eyes. She was a world of trouble he wanted no part of. His life was built on solitude, on the quiet, unyielding discipline of being alone. He had buried his heart once, and he had no intention of digging it up again. "Town has a sheriff," he said, his voice flat. "The sheriff will send me back," she pleaded, tears welling in her eyes and freezing on her lashes. "My father, he will lock me away. Or worse. You do not understand." Oh, but he did. He understood cages. He understood running. He saw in her a desperation he recognized, a ghost from his own past. He wrestled with himself for a long moment, his jaw tight. Every instinct screamed at him to mount his horse and ride away, to forget he ever saw her. But the image of her cowering in the hay, of that man's hand on her arm, stuck in his mind like a burr. He let out a long, slow breath that plumed in the frigid air. "I live 2 days' ride from here," he said, the words tasting like a mistake. "In the high country, there is nothing there." "Nothing is better than this," she whispered. "I can work, I can cook, clean. I will not be a burden." He looked away, toward the jagged, snow-dusted peaks that were his only companions. He was a fool. He knew it. He was letting the world in, just a crack, and that was how the rot started. "Get on the mule," he said gruffly, turning away so he would not have to see the flood of relief on her face. We ride until dark, and you will keep quiet. The journey was a descent into a deeper, wilder silence. The wind that had scoured the town was a mere whisper compared to the roar it became in the open country. It tore at them, relentless and personal. The trail was a faint suggestion, a path that wound through skeletal aspen groves and across vast, empty plains bleached the color of bone. The mountains loomed ahead, a jagged wall of granite and ice that seemed to scrape at the low, bruised sky. Clara clung to the sacks on the pack mule, her body aching with a cold so deep it felt as if it had settled in her marrow. The world she had known, a world of church bells and neat gardens and prescribed order, had ceased to exist. This was a place without forgiveness. She watched the man ahead of her, Elias. He rode his horse with an easy, unconscious grace, a part of the harsh landscape, not a trespasser upon it. He seemed to draw strength from the emptiness that so terrified her. They stopped only once, to cross an icy river. The water, black and frigid, swirled around the horse's legs, and chunks of ice bobbed on the current. Elias dismounted and led the animals across himself, his jaw set against the cold, never once looking back to see if she was all right. The crossing was perilous, a slip meaning certain death, but his calm was absolute. It was the calm of a man who had faced worse things than cold water. As dusk began to bleed across the snowfields, painting them in shades of violet and gray, he finally called a halt. He chose a spot in the lee of a rock outcropping that offered some small protection from the wind. He worked with a silent, practiced efficiency, unsaddling the horses, starting a fire, and skinning a rabbit he'd shot earlier in the day. He did not ask for her help. He did not seem to require it. Clara huddled by the fire, extending her numb hands toward the flames. It was the first real warmth she had felt in days. The fire was a small, defiant circle of light and life in an immense, gathering darkness. The stars that pricked the black sky were cold and diamond-hard, impossibly distant. He handed her a piece of roasted meat on a stick. It was unsalted and gamey, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. They ate in silence. The only sounds, the crackle of the fire and the mournful cry of the wind. The silence between them was not empty. It was a physical presence, heavy with all the things they were not saying. Clara looked at him across the flames. The firelight carved deep shadows on his face, making it seem both older and more weary. She could not reconcile the man who had faced down the stable hands with such cold authority and the man who now sat staring into the fire with such profound loneliness. "Have you ever been in love?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, a small, foolish sound in the great wilderness. Elias did not move. He did not even seem to blink. He continued to stare into the heart of the fire, but something in him went still, a deep, internal bracing. The muscles in his jaw tightened. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer at all, and he did not with words. But the silence that followed her question was different. It was heavier, sharper. It was the silence of a locked room, of a wound that had been touched. He took a final bite of his food, wiped his hands on his trousers, and rose to check on the horses, leaving her alone with the fire and the weight of her unspoken question. They reached his cabin late the next afternoon. It was tucked into a small, sheltered valley, a simple, sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud. A thin tendril of smoke from their campfire was the only sign of human life for 100 miles in any direction. The cabin was not welcoming. It was defiant, a testament to one man's will to endure. Inside, it was sparse and impeccably clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. There was a rough-sawn table with a single chair, a cot in the corner, and shelves holding a few books and neatly stacked supplies. Another small door led to what she assumed was a storage room. It was a space built for one person, and her presence in it felt like a violation. Elias dropped his gear by the door. He did not look at her as he spoke. His back turned as he began to stoke the embers in the hearth. "That room," he said, nodding toward the small door, "is yours. There is a bedroll. The main room is mine." He turned to face her then, his gray eyes clear and cold, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "There are rules. You do not ask questions about my life. You do not touch my things. You do not go into my room." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "And you do not touch me. When the snow melts and the pass is clear, you leave." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, nodding. It was more than she had hoped for, and less than she needed. But it was a reprieve. It was shelter. "I understand," she said, her voice small. "I agree." He seemed satisfied with that. He turned back to the fire, his shoulders set in a way that dismissed her completely. The transaction was complete, but as Clara moved toward the small, dark room that would be her sanctuary, her eyes lingered on him. She saw the web of faint, silvery scars that crossed the backs of his hands, the knuckles that were thick and misshapen, as if they had been broken many times. And in the unguarded moment before he turned away, she saw it again, the deep, unutterable sadness that lived behind his eyes. It was a look she recognized. It was the look of a person whose home was a place that no longer existed. The days in the High Valley settled into a rhythm, stark and simple as the landscape itself. The sun rose, a pale disk behind the granite peaks, and the world was bathed in a cold, blue light. The sun set, and the darkness that fell was absolute, a heavy blanket studded with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Life was reduced to the essential tasks of survival, hauling water from the half-frozen creek, splitting firewood until her shoulders ached, cooking meals of salted meat and hard biscuits. Clara had never known such labor. Back in Missouri, her hands had been kept soft for needlepoint and playing hymns on the parlor organ. Here, they became calloused and strong. She learned the heft of an axe, the particular way to stack wood so it would stay dry, the patience required to coax a stubborn fire to life on a frigid morning. She worked from dawn until dusk, driven by a fierce need to prove she was not a burden. She was earning her keep, earning the shelter of his roof. Elias moved through this rhythm with a quiet, practiced ease. He was a man who wasted no motion and no words. He would disappear for hours, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm, and return with a rabbit or a grouse. He repaired the cabin roof, mended his own tack, and cared for the animals with a gentle, methodical touch that seemed at odds with his formidable presence. They lived together in a silence so profound it felt like a third person in the small cabin. It was not always an uncomfortable silence. Sometimes, as they sat on opposite sides of the hearth in the evening, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. It felt almost peaceful, a shared solitude, but it was a wall nonetheless, carefully constructed and maintained by him. He was kind, in his own spare way. One morning, she found a pair of his old leather gloves, worn soft with use, left on the wood pile. They were far too big, but they saved her hands from the splintered wood. Another day, after she had spent hours mending a tear in his heavy winter coat with neat, careful stitches, she left it folded on the single chair by the table. He never mentioned it, but the next time he wore it, she saw his fingers trace the line of her sewing for a brief moment when he thought she was not looking. These were their conversations. A pair of gloves, a mended coat, a bowl of hot stew left on the hearth for her when she came in from the cold. He rarely looked at her directly. His gaze would slide past her, focusing on the fire, the window, the far wall. It was not a look of unkindness, but of a deep, ingrained caution, as if meeting her eyes was a risk he was unwilling to take. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Clara began to feel something she had not felt in a very long time. Safe. The fear that had been her constant companion since she fled Missouri began to recede. Here, in this wild, empty place, there were no judging eyes, no whispers, No men who looked at her as if she were a piece of property. The dangers were honest ones. The cold, a slip on the ice, the threat of starvation, not the hidden rot of human cruelty. She was protected by the vast, indifferent wilderness and the silent, watchful man who shared it with her. One night, the wind was particularly savage, rattling the window frame and sending gusts of smoke down the chimney. Elias was outside, securing the horses in their lean-to. Clara was sweeping the packed earth floor, the rhythmic scrape of the broom a comfort in the storm. Near the hearth, the broom had caught on the edge of a floorboard, jarring it loose. It was an old cabin. The floor was uneven, full of imperfections. But this one seemed different. Curiosity piqued. She knelt down, using her fingers. She pried at the edge of the board. It came up easily, revealing a small, dark hollow beneath. Her first thought was of a mouse's nest, but nestled in the dirt was a small object wrapped in a piece of oilcloth. Her heart gave a little flutter. It was a secret. In a life as spare and open as this, a secret felt like a treasure. Her hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped it. It was a locket, made of silver, tarnished with age and worn smooth in places from countless touches. It was not ornate, but simple and solid, with a thumbnail. She pried it open. Inside, protected by a thin piece of glass, was not a photograph, but a delicate, hand-drawn sketch. It was the face of a young woman. She was not beautiful in the way the ladies in the Missouri Gazettes were beautiful. Her face was wider, her cheekbones high and strong, her mouth full and unsmiling. A thick, dark braid fell over one shoulder, but it was her eyes that held Clara captive. They were dark and intelligent, filled with a fierce, proud light. Cradled in the woman's arms, wrapped in a blanket decorated with intricate beadwork, was a small baby, its face turned toward its mother's. It was a portrait of profound love, a quiet, sacred moment captured in delicate pencil strokes. Clara felt a pang of something sharp and painful, a longing for a connection so deep it could be seen in the simple curve of a line. She closed the locket and turned it over. On the back, etched in a careful, looping script, was a single word: Wiyaka, a star. She did not know the language, but she knew what it represented: a life, a love, a family. This was the source of the sadness in Elias's eyes. This was the ghost that lived with him in the silent cabin. "What are you doing?" The voice was low, but it cut through the sound of the wind like a whip crack. Clara gasped, her head snapping up. Elias stood in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders, his face a mask of stone. But his eyes, his pale gray eyes, were blazing with a fire she had never seen before. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the locket in her hand. For a moment, he did not move, did not breathe. The stillness in him was more frightening than any shout. When he finally spoke again, his voice was a raw, shaking thing, the sound of a man trying to hold himself together by sheer force of will. "Put it back."
"Elias, I did not mean to,"
she stammered, scrambling to her feet. The locket clutched in her hand. "I told you," he said, taking a step into the room, his fists clenched at his sides. "No questions, no prying." His voice broke on the last word, cracking with a pain so raw it made her flinch. "That is not for you. It is not for anyone. Put it back where you found it." He was not angry, not in the way other men got angry, with bluster and threats. This was something deeper, something more terrible. It was the agony of a wound ripped open. Tears sprang to Clara's eyes.
"I am sorry,"
she whispered, her voice thick.
"Truly, I am so sorry."
She knelt quickly, placed the locket back in its hollow, and fitted the floorboard over it. When she stood up, he had not moved. He was still watching the spot on the floor, his breathing harsh and uneven. She could have retreated to her room. She could have left him to his grief, respected the wall he had so violently reinforced. But in his brokenness, she saw a reflection of her own. She saw a fellow prisoner.
"I know what it is to have a secret shame,"
she said, her voice soft but steady. He looked up at her then, his eyes filled with a wild, haunted light. I know what it is to have something you cannot speak of, something that makes you feel ruined. She took a shaky breath, the confession tumbling out of her, a story she had never told another living soul. That man I was supposed to marry, my father did not arrange a marriage for me. He sold me. He sold me like a milk cow to settle his debts. I heard them talking, haggling over my price. They called me a commodity. They spoke of my purity as if it were a feature on a horse for sale. The story poured out of her, the flight through the swamp, the filth and the fear, the crushing humiliation of being valued only for her body and her biddability. She told him how her father's sermons on sin and redemption now sounded like hypocrisy in her ears, how she felt unclean in a way that had nothing to do with the mud on her dress. So you see, she finished, her voice a raw whisper, I was not prying into your life to be cruel. I was just drawn to a secret, because I am full of them myself. She stood before him, stripped bare by her own story, offering her shame as a strange kind of peace offering. For a long time, Elias just stood there, his face unreadable in the flickering firelight. The fire in his eyes had died down, replaced by a profound, hollow weariness. He looked at her, truly looked at her. For the first time since she had arrived, he saw not just a runaway, but a survivor. Without another word, he turned and walked to his cot, sitting on the edge with his back to her. He did not speak, but he did not tell her to go away. And in the tense, shared silence of the cabin, something had irrevocably shifted. A small crack had appeared in the wall between them. The snow began to fall more heavily in the days that followed. It was no longer a gentle dusting, but a thick, unending curtain of white that buried the valley deeper and deeper. The world shrank until it was just the cabin, the lean-to, and the swirling gray space between them. The cold was a constant, biting presence. Their new, fragile understanding was unspoken. He still kept his distance, but the rigid set of his shoulders seemed to have eased. Occasionally, his eyes would meet hers across the room, and he would hold her gaze for a moment before looking away. They were two solitary creatures, circling each other cautiously in their shared cage. Game became scarce. Elias had to travel farther, for longer, into the high country to hunt. One afternoon, as dusk was falling, she saw him staggering toward the cabin through the driving snow. He was leaning heavily on his rifle like a crutch, and his left leg dragged behind him. Clara's heart seized. She threw open the door and ran out to meet him, the biting wind tearing at her. Elias, what happened? His face was pale and tight with pain. Slipped, he grunted, the single word a monumental effort. On the ridge. It is nothing. But it was not nothing. When she helped him inside, his weight heavy against her, she saw the dark stain spreading across the back of his deerskin shirt, high up by his shoulder blade. He slumped into the chair by the fire, his head lolling forward, his breathing shallow. You are hurt, she said, her voice firm. Let me see. Leave it be, Clara, he rasped, trying to push her away. It is just a scratch. No, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived in a freight wagon. This small cabin, this harsh life, had forged something new in her. That shirt has to come off. The wound needs cleaning, or it will fester. You will get a fever. He resisted, his pride a stubborn wall even when his body was failing him. But he was weak from pain and blood loss, and her resolve was absolute. She ignored his protests, her hands moving with a purpose she did not know she possessed. She gently worked the buttons of his woolen undershirt, her fingers brushing against the cold, damp skin of his chest. He flinched at her touch, a sharp intake of breath, but he did not stop her. Finally, she was able to peel the sticky, blood-soaked fabric away from his back. She gasped. It was a deep, ragged gash, running several inches along his shoulder blade, ugly and inflamed. It was not a scratch. He must have fallen hard against a sharp edge of rock. Old scars, long and pale, crisscrossed his back, a silent map of a violent past. But this new wound was raw and angry. "Stay still," she commanded softly. She fetched a clean rag, a bowl of precious warm water, and the bottle of whiskey he kept on a high shelf. He watched her, his eyes clouded with pain and a kind of dazed surprise.
"This will sting,"
she warned. She poured some of the whiskey onto the rag and gently, carefully, began to clean the wound. He hissed, his whole body going rigid. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound of pure agony. His hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He was a man accustomed to bearing pain in silence, but this was too much. Clara's touch was steady, her movements deft. She cleaned the gash with a tenderness that was almost reverent, her heart aching for him, for the terrible loneliness of his suffering. As she worked, she felt the rigid wall of his self-control begin to crumble. His shoulders slumped in surrender. He let his head hang, his body pliant under her care. The air in the cabin was thick with the scent of whiskey and blood, and with an intimacy so profound it was almost unbearable. Here, in this moment of vulnerability, he was not the silent, intimidating frontiersman. He was just a man, hurt and in pain, and she was not a ruined runaway. She was a woman with gentle hands and a capacity for care. When she had cleaned the wound as best she could, she tore a strip from one of her few clean petticoats to make a bandage. As she tied it carefully in place, her cheek brushed against the top of his shoulder. His skin was cold. He winced as she tightened the knot, a barely audible sound. She leaned close, her lips near his ear, and her next words were a breath, a whisper meant only for him, a confession from one wounded soul to another. "I know what it feels like to be hurt where no one can see." Elias went utterly still. He did not respond, did not move, but she felt a tremor run through him, a deep, internal shudder. She finished her work and moved away, giving him back his space. He sat for a long time, staring into the fire, his back to her. Later that night, long after the fire had burned down to glowing embers, Clara lay awake on her bedroll. The cabin was dark and silent, save for the ever-present moan of the wind. Then she heard it, a small, choked sound from the main room. She held her breath, listening. It came again, a quiet, ragged sob, hastily suppressed. And then another. It was Elias. He was weeping. It was not a loud or dramatic grief, but the quiet, heartbreaking sound of a dam that had finally, after years of holding back a river of pain, begun to crack. He thought she was asleep. He thought he was alone in the vast, dark wilderness. But she heard him, and she lay in the darkness, her own tears tracking silently down her temples, listening to the sound of his heart breaking. After that night, the air in the cabin changed. The silence was no longer empty. It was charged, filled with a humming tension, a strange and powerful awareness that vibrated just beneath the surface of their quiet lives. The wall between them was still there, but it was now translucent. They could see each other through it. Desire, quiet and unexpected, flickered to life in the small spaces between them. It was there in the way his eyes would linger on her for a beat too long as she stood by the fire, the flames turning her hair to spun gold. It was in the way her breath would catch when she handed him a cup of coffee and their fingers brushed, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through her entire body. He watched her hands, now calloused but still graceful, as she kneaded dough for their daily bread. She watched his broad back as he stood at the window, staring out at the unending snow, and felt a strange, protective ache in her chest. They were two people trapped by a storm, nursing wounds the world could not see, but in the fragile shelter of the cabin, in the stolen glances and the profound, shared silence, something new and dangerous and beautiful was beginning to take root. The snow that had been a constant quiet companion turned traitor. It fell not in soft, forgiving flakes, but in a hard, driving onslaught, flung from a sky the color of lead. The wind, which had for weeks been a mournful singer in the pines, now became a shrieking entity, a physical force that battered the small cabin. The world outside the single grimy window disappeared, erased by a swirling vortex of white. They were trapped, not for a day, but for a week that stretched into an eternity, their world shrinking to the 4 log walls of the cabin. At first, the enforced proximity was a tense, awkward dance. They moved around each other with a heightened awareness, the small space crackling with unspoken thoughts. The silence, once a comfort, became a vessel, and day by day, it began to fill with words. It started in the evenings. The blizzard raged outside, a constant, violent roar that made the small circle of firelight feel like the only safe place in the universe. There was nothing to do but feed the fire, listen to the storm, and finally, to talk. One night, as he stared into the hypnotic dance of the flames, Elias spoke. His voice was low, rough with disuse, as if he were pulling the words up from a deep, cold well. Her name was Wiaka, he said, his eyes never leaving the fire. Clara froze, her hands still in a bowl of mending. She did not speak, did not breathe, knowing that any sound might shatter the fragile moment. It means star in her language, he continued, the words coming slowly, painfully. She was Lakota. I met her when I was trapping up on the Powder River. She was not like anyone I had ever known. She was fearless. She knew the land not as something to be conquered, but as something to be listened to. She smelled of sage and wood smoke. He fell silent for a long moment, lost in a memory that was so vivid Clara could almost see it reflected in the flames. I was younger then, foolish. I thought a man could have it all. A piece of land, a wife, a family. I thought we could build a life between 2 worlds. I filed a claim on a piece of bottomland, built a small sod house. We had a son, Little Hawk. We called him... The pain in his voice was a physical thing now, a raw, serrated edge. The other settlers, they did not see a family. They saw a white man living in sin with a native woman. They saw a half-breed child who did not belong anywhere. They whispered. They said the land was stolen, that I had traded my soul for a squaw. He spat the word out like poison. There was a dispute over grazing rights. It was an excuse. They came at dusk, a dozen of them, their faces twisted with hate. They called it progress. They said they were cleansing the valley. He finally turned his head, and his gray eyes, bleak as the winter sky, met hers. They set fire to the house. Wiaka ran out, carrying Little Hawk. I tried to stop them. They held me back, made me watch. He looked down at his hands, at the scarred and broken knuckles, as if seeing them for the first time. She did not scream, she just looked at me, and then they shot her. They did not just kill them, they erased them, and they left me there in the ashes, a man with 2 ghosts. He said nothing more. He did not have to. The story hung in the air, a tale of such profound loss that it seemed to have seeped into the very logs of the cabin. It explained everything, his silence, his solitude, the haunted look in his eyes. Clara ached with a need to comfort him, but she knew that pity was the last thing he would tolerate. Words were useless in the face of such a wound. So instead, she offered him the only thing she had, her own brokenness. I have nightmares, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper in the roaring silence that followed his confession. I am back in my father's study. The room always smells of lemon polish and old paper. He is standing over me, his Bible in his hand, and he is not shouting. He is speaking in that calm, righteous voice he uses for his sermons, the voice that can make a sinner feel the flames of hell. She hugged her knees to her chest, her gaze turning inward. He calls me ruined. He says I have shamed his house, that I'm an ungrateful child who has thrown away God's grace. And then he says the words I heard him say to Silas Croft. He calls me unsellable. He says, "What man would pay a price for such damaged goods?" The last words were choked with a shame so deep it had poisoned her blood. She looked at Elias, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. He did not just take my future. He took my past. He made every good and pure thing I was raised to believe in feel like a lie. They sat there for a long time. Two survivors adrift on the sea of the storm, their confessions laid bare between them. He had lost a family to the fire of hatred. She had lost a soul to the cold poison of piety. Different wounds, but the same invisible scars. The storm did not break. The days bled into one another, a seamless expanse of white. The tension in the cabin, once born of restraint, was now a different beast entirely. It was a current of longing, of a desperate human need for contact that grew more powerful with every shared story, every stolen glance. One afternoon, the need for a different kind of quiet drove Clara to the small lean-to that served as a barn. The air inside was cold but still, a welcome respite from the ceaseless howl of the wind. It smelled of hay and horse, an earthy, honest smell. She sat on an overturned bucket, her head in her hands, and finally let the tears come. She wept for Wiyaka and her child, for Elias and his bottomless grief, and for herself, for the girl she had been and the woman she was terrified she might never become. The sobs were silent, shaking her whole body, a storm within the storm. She did not hear him approach. She only knew he was there when a large, warm hand came to rest on her shoulder. She looked up, startled, her face streaked with tears. Elias stood over her, his expression unreadable but for the concern that softened the hard lines around his eyes. He did not speak. He simply knelt in front of her, his presence a solid, comforting weight in the cold air. He smelled of pine smoke and snow. His thumb moved, gently wiping a tear from her cheek. The touch was hesitant, almost reverent, as if he were touching something impossibly fragile. His fingers were calloused and rough, but his touch was the gentlest thing she had ever known. "Do not," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Do not let them break you." She looked into his eyes, and, for the first time, she did not see a wall. She saw a man as lost and lonely as she was. And in that moment, the tension that had been building for weeks finally snapped. He leaned in slowly, cautiously, giving her every chance to turn away. His eyes asked a question his lips could not form. She did not move. She did not breathe. She watched as his face came closer, his gaze fixed on her mouth. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, aching tenderness. It was tentative, uncertain, the kiss of a man who had forgotten how. His lips were chapped from the cold, and they trembled slightly against hers. It was a kiss that tasted of sorrow and snow and a desperate, fragile hope. He pulled back after a moment, his eyes searching hers, full of fear and a heartbreaking vulnerability. He looked like a man on the edge of a cliff, terrified of falling. Clara reached up and laid her hand against his rough cheek. Her voice, when she spoke, was a steady, quiet whisper. "You can kiss me like you mean it," she said. "I will not break." It was a release. It was permission. A tremor went through him, and he leaned in again. This time, the kiss was deeper, firmer. It was a kiss of shared grief and burgeoning desire, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them in the heart of the storm. It was a promise that they were no longer alone. That night, the unspoken question hung in the air between their two separate beds. The thought of sleeping alone, of returning to the solitude of their own cold corners after such a profound connection, was unbearable. He was the one who broke the silence, his voice a low murmur in the darkness. "The fire will die soon. It will be a cold night." It was an excuse, a transparently fragile offering. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "Yes," she whispered back into the darkness. "It will." She heard the rustle of his blankets, and then his shadow moved across the dying firelight. He came to her small room, a silhouette against the dark. He stood there for a moment, and she knew he was giving her one last chance to refuse. She simply moved over on her narrow bedroll, making a space for him. He lay down beside her, fully clothed, the rough wool of his shirt scratching against her arm. He was careful not to press against her, keeping a sliver of cold air between them. They lay side by side, two rigid forms in the darkness, listening to the sound of each other's breathing. Then, slowly, hesitantly, his hand found hers under the blankets, his fingers, large and calloused, wrapped around hers, his grip tight and sure, and in that simple, chaste embrace, Clara felt a sense of peace and safety that was more profound than any passion. They did not speak. They did not move. They just held hands in the darkness, two solitary ships that had found a safe harbor, while the blizzard raged on outside. The storm broke 2 days later. The world was reborn, pristine and silent under a thick blanket of new snow. The sun that rose was dazzling, turning the valley into a sea of diamonds. The reprieve felt like a miracle, a new beginning. Their new intimacy was a quiet, fragile thing. They moved with a shared grace, the space between them no longer an obstacle but a connection, a shared smile over a hot cup of coffee, the way he would place a log on the fire for her without being asked, the way she would watch him from the window as he cleared a path to the creek, her heart filled with a feeling so new and fierce she did not dare give it a name. A week later, a shape appeared on the horizon. It was a man on snowshoes, pulling a small supply sled, a trader named Jed, one of the few who made the trek into the high country before the spring thaw. His arrival was a jarring intrusion of the outside world. He was a jovial, talkative man, full of news and gossip from the town and beyond. He brought coffee and salt and a month-old newspaper, as he and Elias bartered. Clara stayed in the background, her heart pounding with a nameless dread. "Craziest thing, though," Jed said, blowing on his coffee. "Got a new notice up at the trading post from a preacher back in Missouri, offering a $200 reward for the return of his daughter, name of Clara Thompson." The coffee cup in Clara's hand trembled, sloshing the hot liquid over her fingers. She did not feel the burn. Jed continued, oblivious. "Says she ran off on her wedding day. The notice claims she is mentally unfit and prone to delusions. Says she was defiled by vagrants on her journey and needs to be returned for her own protection and spiritual salvation. $200 is a lot of money. Got half the men in the territory keeping an eye out for a confused-looking girl in a ruined dress." The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Mentally unfit, defiled. Her father had not just cast her out, he had branded her. He had stripped her of her sanity and her virtue in a single public notice, turning her into a piece of damaged goods to be hunted and captured. After the trader had gone, a heavy, cold silence descended on the cabin. The fragile peace had been shattered. Elias stood by the window, his back to her, for a long, tense time. When he finally turned, his face was a mask of granite, his eyes as cold and distant as they had been the day they met. "You cannot stay here," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "What?" Clara whispered, her blood running cold. "You heard him," Elias said, his voice hard. $200. They will tear this valley apart looking for you. And when they find you here, with me." He did not finish the sentence. He did not have to. He was a man with a tainted name, a man who had loved a Lakota woman. For her to be found with him would be the final nail in the coffin of her reputation. It would prove everything the notice said. "I do not care about my reputation," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. "That was destroyed the moment my father wrote those lies." "I care," he shot back, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea what they will say? What they will do to you? I will not be the man who destroys what is left of you. You are the man who has saved me." she cried, taking a step toward him.
Elias, please, this is the only place I have ever felt safe. Let me decide what is best for me.
No, he said, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists.
The risk is too great.
I have seen what men like that do. I have seen it up close. I will not have your pain on my conscience. I will not add another ghost to this cabin. He was pushing her away, retreating back behind his wall of pain, locking her out. His words were a denial of everything that had passed between them. He was making a choice for her, treating her like a child, just as her father had. A hot, furious anger rose in her, drowning out the fear.
So you will just send me away?
She demanded, her voice rising to a shout. Back out there to be hunted like an animal, after everything, after these weeks? Was any of it real to you? It is because it was real that you have to go, he yelled, his control finally snapping. He took a step toward her, his face a mask of anguish. Do you not understand? I would rather disappear off the face of this earth than see you hurt because of me. His words were meant to protect her, but they felt like the cruelest rejection. He was choosing his guilt over her love, his past over their future. The injustice of it, the sheer, heartbreaking waste of it, ignited a fire in her. She met his anguished gaze with a blaze of her own.
And I,
she shouted back, her voice ringing with a strength she did not know she possessed.
I would rather be hurt again than sleep alone without you one more night.
The words hung in the air between them, a raw and desperate truth. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by their ragged breathing. Elias stared at her, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a look of utter devastation. He looked as if she had struck him. Without another word, he turned, wrenched open the cabin door, and walked out into the blinding, snow-covered world. He did not take his coat. He did not take his rifle. He just walked away, a dark figure against the infinite white, until the valley swallowed him whole. Clara stood at the open door, the frigid air rushing in, and watched him go. She did not call after him. She sank to her knees on the cold floor, the last of her strength gone, and let the sobs come. He did not return that night. Clara did not sleep. She kept the fire roaring, her eyes fixed on the dark, empty doorway, praying to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. The temperature plummeted, and a new, sharp wind rose, moaning around the corners of the cabin. She imagined him out there, alone in the freezing dark, and a terror colder than any blizzard gripped her heart. Dawn came, painting the snow in shades of pale rose and lavender, and with the first light, she saw him. He was a staggering, stumbling figure in the distance, moving with a slowness that terrified her. She ran out to meet him, her bare feet sinking into the deep snow. He was covered in a fine layer of frost, his hair and eyebrows white. His face was a ghastly shade of blue-gray, his lips cracked and bleeding. He was shaking uncontrollably, his body racked with violent shivers. He had been defeated, not by an enemy, not by an argument, but by the brutal, indifferent cold and the long, dark night of his own soul. He did not seem to see her until she was right in front of him. He stopped, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a terrible, raw clarity, fixing on her face. He looked at her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was dissolving around him. And then, the proud, silent man, who had never bent for anyone or anything, fell to his knees in the snow at her feet. The first thing she did was drag him. It was a dead, clumsy weight, a body surrendering to the cold. She hooked her arms under his and pulled, her feet slipping in the snow, her breath tearing from her lungs in ragged, white plumes. He was a tall man, and the short distance from the edge of the clearing to the cabin door felt like a mile. She did not think. She did not feel the cold. There was only the singular, desperate purpose of getting him inside, of pulling him back from the white abyss that had tried to claim him. Inside, she barred the door against the cold and knelt beside him. His skin had a waxy, bluish pallor, and his lips were the color of slate. His shivering was so violent, it seemed as if his bones were rattling against each other. She knew from tales of lost trappers that warmth, given too quickly, could be as deadly as the cold itself. It had to be a slow, careful resurrection. She worked with a frantic, focused energy. First, she cut away his frozen boots and peeled off the stiff, ice-encrusted trousers and shirt. His skin was shockingly cold to the touch, like stone. She chafed his hands and feet with rough wool blankets, trying to bring life back to the frozen flesh, whispering his name over and over. A desperate, rhythmic prayer. "Elias, Elias, come back. Do not leave me." He was barely conscious, his eyes half open and unfocused, a low, continuous moan rumbling in his chest. She stripped off her own outer layers and lay beside him on the floor in front of the hearth, piling every blanket and pelt they owned on top of them. She wrapped her body around his, trying to force her own living warmth into his frozen limbs. It was a stark, sexless intimacy, the desperate act of one animal trying to save another from the cold. Hours passed, the fire roared, and slowly, agonizingly, the life began to seep back into him. The shivering subsided, replaced by a deep, shuddering tremor. Color returned to his face, and with it came the pain. He cried out, a sharp, guttural sound, as the blood began to flow back into his frost-bitten fingers and toes. The returning life was an agony. Clara held him, murmuring soothing nonsense, her tears dripping onto his face, her own body aching with exhaustion and cold. By nightfall, he was lucid. He lay on his cot, wrapped in blankets, his face pale and haggard but his eyes clear. She brought him a hot broth, holding the spoon to his lips as if he were a child. He drank it, his gaze never leaving her face. The walls he had so carefully built, the silence, the distance, the blizzard, and his long night in the snow had torn them all down. He had walked to the edge of death, and when he returned, he was a different man. He was stripped bare. She sat on the floor by his cot, her back against the warm stones of the hearth. The cabin was quiet but for the soft hiss of the fire. The storm of the past days, both outside and within, had finally passed, leaving a strange, fragile peace in its wake. "Clara," he said, his voice a raw, cracked whisper. She looked up. He had pushed himself up onto one elbow. His eyes filled with an emotion so raw and powerful it made her breath catch. It was a look of utter, devastating need. He reached out a hand, his fingers still swollen and tender from the cold. He did not speak again. He did not have to. His eyes, his hand, his entire being was a question, a plea, a surrender. She went to him. She sat on the edge of the cot and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. The touch was electric, a current of all the things they had never said, all the feelings they had so carefully suppressed. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of such profound, humble gratitude that it broke her heart. And then he gently pulled her down toward him. This time, there was no hesitation. The kiss was not the tentative, trembling exploration in the barn. It was the deep, desperate kiss of a man who had been starving. It was a raw, aching confirmation of what her heart had screamed at him in the snow. She would not sleep alone again. Passion, when it finally broke, was not a firestorm. It was a slow, deliberate melting, like a river breaking free from the ice in spring. The tension that had held them captive for so long did not snap. It dissolved. It was a shedding of clothes, of blankets, of layers of armor that had been worn for a lifetime. He was gentle at first, his hands tracing the curve of her jaw, her shoulders, her back, as if he were memorizing her, as if he could not believe she was real. And she, who had been taught to fear the touch of a man, who had been treated as a commodity, found that in his hands she was not an object, but a woman. His touch was not one of possession, but of worship. She did not feel ruined. She felt sacred. Then, as their bodies learned each other in the warm firelight, a new urgency took hold. It was the urgency of two people who had been utterly alone and had found, against all odds, a harbor in one another. It was a fierce, claiming kiss, a tangle of limbs, a desperate, unspoken need to erase the space between them, to become a single entity against the vast, cold emptiness of the world. This was not just a physical union. It was a violent, beautiful collision of two souls. It was a stripping away of grief, a burning away of guilt. It was the silent, desperate language of two people who had nothing left to lose and had found, in each other, everything. In the quiet aftermath, they lay tangled together under the heavy pelts, their bodies slick with sweat, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls, and Elias began to weep. It was not the quiet, hidden sobbing she had heard in the night. It was a deep, soul-shattering grief, the sound of a man who had held his pain in silence for so long that its release was a physical agony. His body shook with it, and he buried his face in her hair, whispering her name over and over again, like a prayer, like an anchor. "Clara! Clara!" She did not try to stop him. She simply held him, her arms wrapped tightly around his shaking back. She ran her fingers through his hair, and with her lips, she traced the map of scars on his skin. She kissed the long, pale line on his shoulder, the puckered mark on his ribs, the fresh, tender wound from his fall. Each scar was a story of pain he had endured alone.
"I am here,"
she whispered against his skin.
"I am not leaving."
When his weeping finally subsided into ragged breaths, he looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed and raw, but clear for the first time. The ghosts were gone.
"I want a life with you, Elias,"
she told him, her voice steady and sure in the quiet of the cabin.
"Even if we never speak another word. I want this, a life of silence, with you."
He simply tightened his arms around her, and in that embrace, a silent vow was made. The next morning, the world felt new. Elias was weak, but his fever was gone. He sat at the table, watching her as she moved about the cabin, a small, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time.
"Clara,"
he said, his voice still hoarse. She turned from the fire, a question in her eyes.
"I want to marry you proper."
Her heart gave a lurch. "A preacher," she began, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Not with a preacher, not for a law or a church. For us, I want to make a promise. Here, on this land. A vow between two survivors, that whatever comes, we face it together." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of a deep, quiet joy.
"Yes,"
she whispered. "Yes, Elias." As the days passed and the snow began to thaw under a strengthening sun, a new energy filled the cabin. They began to repair it. To build, it was as if in mending the structure, they were mending their own lives, together. They replaced the rotting logs in the north wall, their hands often brushing, their movements a comfortable, easy dance. He taught her how to mix mud and grass to chink the walls, and her laughter, clear and bright, echoed in the valley for the first time as she smeared a playful smudge on his nose. He began to build a porch onto the front of the cabin. It was a defiant act of permanence, a statement that this was no longer just a temporary shelter, but a home, a place to sit and watch the sun set, a place to build a future. They were no longer two solitary souls sharing a space, but partners, building a life from the ground up. Their peace lasted for 3 weeks, 3 weeks of quiet joy, of shared work, of nights spent wrapped in each other's arms. It was a fragile, beautiful bubble, and they both knew, in the back of their minds, that it was destined to burst. The bounty hunter arrived on a Tuesday, when the last of the snow was melting in dirty patches on the valley floor. He was not like the trader. He was a tall, rangy man with a cruel, thin mouth and pale, colorless eyes that seemed to see everything in terms of its monetary value. He rode a lean, mean-looking sorrel and had 2 pistols strapped to his hips. He did not ask for permission to dismount. He simply swung himself out of the saddle and strode toward the cabin as if he owned it. Elias, who had been splitting wood, straightened up, the axe held loosely in his hand. He positioned himself between the stranger and the cabin door, where Clara had frozen, a basket of laundry in her hands. "Looking for something?" Elias asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The man's thin lips twisted into a smirk. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "Looking for a piece of property," he said, his voice a lazy drawl. "Goes by the name of Clara Thompson. Preacher in Missouri is paying good money for her return. Notice here says she is mentally unfit. Damaged goods." He let his pale eyes drift over Clara, a look of contemptuous assessment that made her skin crawl. It was the same look Silas Croft had given her, the look of a man appraising livestock. "You have made a mistake," Elias said, his voice dropping even lower. "There is no one here by that name." The bounty hunter chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Do not play games with me. Coulter, your name is known in this territory. The half-breed lover, hiding another piece of damaged property. Are you? I am not leaving without the girl. The reward is $200. I will give you 20 to step aside and forget you ever saw me." "Get off my land," Elias said, the words as final as a death sentence. The bounty hunter's smirk vanished. "Have it your way." He moved with a snake-like speed, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip, but Elias was faster. He did not reach for a gun. He lunged forward, using the axe handle to knock the man's arm aside as the pistol fired, the shot going wide and splintering the door frame next to Clara's head. She screamed, dropping the basket. It was not a gunfight. It was a brutal, bare-knuckle brawl. The bounty hunter was wiry and quick, but Elias was fueled by a cold, protective rage that made him a force of nature. He fought with his fists, with his feet, with a sheer, desperate will to keep this man from laying a hand on Clara. They crashed against the cabin wall, their grunts of pain and effort mingling with the bounty hunter's curses. Clara stood frozen for a moment, paralyzed by terror. Then she saw the bounty hunter pull a knife from his boot. He lunged, and the blade sliced across Elias's arm, leaving a deep, bloody gash. Elias roared in pain but did not back down. Something inside Clara snapped. The frightened preacher's daughter died in that instant, and a new woman, a woman forged in the harsh Wyoming wilderness, was born. She ran back into the cabin, her eyes falling on the rifle Elias kept mounted over the fireplace. Her hands did not shake as she lifted it down. It was heavy, unfamiliar, but in that moment, it felt like an extension of her own will. She ran back outside. The 2 men were locked together, Elias bleeding freely from his arm, his face a mask of grim determination. She did not aim for the man. She aimed for his horse, the symbol of his power, his ability to chase them. She lifted the rifle, sighted down the long barrel, and fired. The crack of the shot was deafening. The sorrel screamed, a high, terrifying sound, and collapsed, its leg folding under it at an unnatural angle. The bounty hunter froze, his head snapping around to look at her, his pale eyes wide with disbelief. That moment of distraction was all Elias needed. He landed a savage blow to the man's jaw, and the bounty hunter crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Elias stood over him, panting, blood dripping from his arm onto the muddy ground. He looked at Clara, at the rifle still clutched in her hands, and a look of fierce, terrible pride passed between them. But there was no time for relief. The man would wake up, and he would not be alone. They had to run. "The cave," Elias rasped, clutching his bleeding arm. "By the river! Go!" They gathered what they could in minutes. Blankets, a little food, the small bag of medical supplies Clara kept. They did not look back at the cabin, at the porch, at the life they had just begun to build. They fled into the woods, Elias leaning on her, leaving a trail of blood in the melting snow. The cave was small and cold. hidden behind a curtain of willows near the riverbank. It was a damp, miserable shelter, but it was safe. Clara made Elias lie down on a bed of blankets and tore strips from her skirt to bandage his wounds. The gash on his arm was deep, and he had a nasty cut on his forehead. By nightfall, he was burning with fever. She nursed him through the long night, bathing his face with cool water from the river, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips. He tossed and turned, lost in a delirium, crying out names she did not recognize alongside the names of Wiyaka and Little Hawk. She was his only anchor to the present, his only shield against the ghosts of his past. Sometime in the deep, dark hours before dawn, his fever broke, and he fell into a natural, healing sleep. Clara lay down beside him, her body aching with an exhaustion that went bone deep. She listened to the sound of his steady breathing and the gentle murmur of the river outside. She knew the bounty hunter would go back to town, that he would return with more men. Their time was running out. She might be taken from this place. From him. She leaned close, her lips brushing his ear, and whispered into the quiet dark of the cave. "Elias," she murmured, not knowing if he could hear her. "If they take me, promise me something. Promise me that you will not stop living. Promise me you will not let the ghosts come back. Promise me." He did not stir, but she felt his hand move in his sleep, his fingers finding hers and clasping them tightly. And in the cold, dark cave, that was answer enough. For 2 days, the cave was their world, a damp, cold sanctuary smelling of wet stone and fear. Elias's fever was gone, replaced by a deep, weary ache. The gash on his arm was beginning to heal, but his movements were slow, his face etched with pain. Clara tended to him with a fierce, quiet devotion, but with every passing hour, the reality of their situation pressed in on them. They were fugitives, trapped. The bounty hunter was not a man who would give up. He would be back, and he would not be alone. On the 3rd morning, as she watched Elias struggle to sit up, a new kind of resolve hardened in Clara's heart. Fear was a cage, and she was done with cages. She had run from her father. She had fled the town. She had hidden in a cave. The running had to stop. "I am going to the town," she announced, her voice startlingly firm in the quiet of the cave. Elias looked up, his eyes sharp with alarm. "No, it is too dangerous. They will be looking for you." "They will be looking for a girl in a tattered wedding dress," she countered, her mind already working, piecing together a desperate plan. "A frightened girl." "I am not that person anymore." She looked down at her own clothes, the simple wool skirt and blouse he had given her, now stained with mud and his own blood. "I will go as someone else, a woman heading east. I will listen. I will see how many men he has, what they are planning. We cannot fight what we cannot see. Elias, we cannot stay in this cave forever." He wanted to argue. She saw the protest forming on his lips, the protective instinct that was now so deeply ingrained in him. But he also saw the look in her eyes. It was not the wild, panicked look of a cornered animal. It was the steady, determined gaze of a woman who had finally claimed her own strength. He was still too weak to make the journey himself. He had to trust her. He nodded slowly, a single, reluctant gesture. "There is an old dress of my mother's in the cabin, in a trunk at the foot of my cot, and a heavy shawl." The journey back to the cabin was a tense, furtive trip through the woods. The body of the bounty hunter was gone. A dark, ugly patch stained the ground where he had fallen. His horse was also gone, likely put out of its misery and dragged away for meat. The sight sent a chill through Clara. The man was alive, and he was angry. Inside, the cabin felt cold and empty, a shell of the home they had started to build. She found the trunk. The dress was dark gray wool, simple and worn, the kind a farmer's wife might wear. It smelled of cedar and thyme. She put it on, the rough fabric a strange comfort against her skin. She found the shawl, a thick, dark green thing and wrapped it around her head and shoulders, hiding her distinctive pale hair. She rubbed a bit of soot from the fireplace onto her cheeks, altering the shape of her face, making her look haggard and tired. When she looked at her faint reflection in the window pane, a stranger looked back. Before she left, she knelt and pried up the loose floorboard by the hearth. She took out the silver locket. She did not open it. She simply closed her fist around its cool, smooth shape and slipped it deep into her pocket. A silent promise, a piece of his heart to take with her. The walk to town was long and cold. She kept to the trees, moving like a shadow. Her senses stretched taut. The town, when she finally reached it, was even uglier than she remembered. The wind was not blowing, and a sullen gray calm had settled over the muddy street. It was a silence that felt menacing, full of whispers and watchful eyes. She kept her head down, her shoulders hunched, and walked with the weary shuffle of a woman who had traveled a long way. She went to the trading post, the one place where news and gossip flowed as freely as cheap whiskey. The air inside was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and simmering resentment. A group of men were gathered around the pot-bellied stove, their voices low and angry. The bounty hunter, a man named Silas, was among them. A crude bandage wrapped around his head, his face swollen and bruised. Clara moved to the far side of the store, pretending to examine a bolt of calico, her ears straining to catch their words. "I tell you, he is not human," Silas was saying, his voice a venomous rasp. "Fights like a cornered wolf, and the girl, she is bewitched by him. Shot my horse out from under me. Cold as you please." A stout man with a blacksmith's apron spat a stream of tobacco juice toward the stove. "Always knew Coulter was bad blood. My PA told me about him. Took up with some Lakota squaw years ago. Folks back then should have run him out of the territory for good. He is nothing but filthy, half-breed loving trash." Another man chimed in, his face red with drink. "An animal, living up there in the rocks. It is a stain on this territory. And now he has corrupted a white girl, a preacher's daughter. It is an abomination." The words were like stones, striking Clara one by one. She felt a cold, sick dread coiling in her stomach. This was not just about a bounty anymore. This had become something far darker. "The reward is 200, Silas said, his pale eyes gleaming. "But I say there is a bigger reward to be had, a cleansing. We ride up there at dawn, a dozen of us. We will get the girl, and we will burn that cabin to the ground. We will smoke the animal out of his den and teach him what happens to men who forget their own kind." A low murmur of agreement went through the group. They were not men of the law. They were a mob, their faces ugly with a self-righteous hatred, stoked by greed and prejudice. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She had to get out. She grabbed a small sack of flour, paid for it with one of the few coins Elias had given her, and fled the store, her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not run. She forced herself to walk, to keep her head down, to melt back into the landscape. But once she was clear of the town, once the trees closed in around her, she ran. She ran with the mob's ugly words echoing in her head, the image of their faces twisted with hate, burned into her mind. She found Elias by the river, cleaning his wounds. He looked up as she burst through the willows, his face instantly tightening with alarm when he saw the terror in her eyes. "They are coming," she gasped, leaning against a tree for support, her lungs on fire. "At dawn, a dozen of them. They are not just coming for me. They are coming for you. They are going to burn the cabin." She began to sob, the terror and the helplessness overwhelming her. "We have to run. Elias, we have to go now. Keep heading north. We can disappear into the mountains." He came to her, his movement stiff with pain, and took her by the shoulders. He waited until her sobbing subsided, his grip firm and steady. "No," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "What?" she whispered, looking up at him in disbelief. Did you not hear me? They will kill you. Running is what they expect, he said, his gray eyes burning with a cold, clear light she had never seen before. It is what I have always done. I ran after they killed Wiyaka. I ran for my own life. I built that cabin to hide, not to live. But it is my home now. Clara, you are my home. I am done running. He was choosing this. He was choosing to stand his ground, not just for her, but for himself. He was choosing to face the ghosts that had haunted him for so long. They will have fire, she pleaded, her voice breaking. Then we will meet them with fire of our own, he said. His decision was made. It was a terrible, beautiful, and utterly terrifying thing. They returned to the cabin not as fugitives, but as defenders. The hours until dawn were a blur of desperate, frantic activity. The sun set, casting long, bloody shadows across the valley, and the temperature began to drop. A few stray snowflakes, harbingers of a new storm, began to drift down from the darkening sky. The work was brutal, while Elias, his wounded arm making every movement an effort, fashioned crude traps near the main path, a tripwire made of vine, a heavy deadfall log propped precariously over the trail. Clara dug. She used a rusted spade she found in the lean-to, her hands quickly blistering and then bleeding. She dug a shallow trench behind the woodpile, a small earthwork that offered a sliver of cover. The ground was hard, half frozen, and every shovelful felt like a monumental effort. But she worked with a grim, relentless rhythm, fueled by fear and a defiant love. They brought everything inside, water from the creek, the last of the firewood, both rifles, and every box of ammunition Elias owned. They barred the door and shuttered the single window. The cabin became a fortress, a small, desperate island in an ocean of encroaching darkness. By midnight, there was nothing left to do but wait. The snow was falling more steadily now, thick, wet flakes that muffled the world in a heavy silence, the silence of a graveyard. They sat on the floor before the hearth, the two rifles leaning against the wall beside them. The fire was banked low, to save wood and cast as little light as possible outside. Elias was cleaning his pistol, his movements slow and methodical. Clara was just trying to breathe. She began to weep, the tears silent, tracking paths through the soot on her cheeks. The strain of the last few days, the terror of what the dawn would bring, had finally broken through her resolve. I used to believe, she whispered, her voice a choked, broken thing, that my only worth was in being what my father wanted me to be, a good daughter, a preacher's wife. She took a shuddering breath. I believed that no one could ever truly love me if I was not pure, if I was not a virgin for my husband. It was all I was ever taught. My body was a vessel for a man's honor, and my soul was a thing to be saved by a man's guidance. She looked at him, her eyes pleading for an understanding she could not articulate. When I ran, I thought I had thrown it all away. I thought I was ruined, just like he said, unsellable, damaged goods. I believed that no good man would ever want me. Elias put down his pistol and turned to her. He gathered her into his arms, pulling her close against his chest. He held her tightly, his hand stroking her hair, his body a warm, solid shield against the cold and the fear. He let her cry until her tears were spent, until she was limp with exhaustion in his arms. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes in the dim firelight were serious and incredibly tender. Clara, he said, his voice low and fierce with conviction. Before your father, before me, before any of it, you were whole. He gently touched the center of her chest with his fingertips. That thing in here, the part of you that is brave and kind and strong enough to survive a blizzard and face down a mob, that was always there. No one gave it to you, and no one can take it away. You were always whole. His words were not just a comfort. They were a revelation. They were the truth she had been searching for her entire life. They severed the last of her father's chains. In his eyes, She was not damaged. She was complete. She leaned in and kissed him, a kiss of profound, heartbreaking gratitude. They dozed fitfully in each other's arms, waiting for the dawn. It came not as a light, but as a subtle graying of the darkness, and with it came the sound of men's voices, low and ugly, carried on the cold morning air. Elias was on his feet in an instant, his face grim, his movements sure. He handed Clara one of the rifles. "Stay away from the window. Do not fire unless I do." She nodded, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Her hands, raw and bleeding from digging the trench, were surprisingly steady as she gripped the heavy rifle. They came out of the trees like specters in the snowy dawn. A dozen of them, maybe more. They carried rifles and clubs and, worst of all, flickering pine knot torches that cast a hellish, dancing light on their faces. They were a faceless, hydra-headed monster, united in their hatred. They stopped just outside of rifle range, a ragged line of menace. Elias unbarred the door and stepped out onto the new porch, his own rifle held at his side. He did not raise it. He simply stood there, a solitary, defiant figure. After a moment's hesitation, Clara came out and stood beside him. She was terrified, but the thought of hiding while he faced this alone was impossible. They would face this together. She raised her rifle, the cold stock pressed against her cheek. The mob stirred, their voices a low, angry growl. The bounty hunter, Silas, stepped forward. "Coulter, send out the girl. We have no quarrel with you if you give her up now. But we will have her, and we will burn this filth to the ground." "This is my home," Elias called back, his voice ringing out clear and steady in the cold air. "And this is my wife. You are not welcome here. Leave now." The word wife struck the men with a visible shock. It was a claim, a declaration that changed everything. A furious roar went up from the mob. They surged forward, their torches held high. This was it. Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. "Hold your ground, men!" The voice was not Elias's. It was a woman's voice, sharp and commanding, cracking through the tense air like a bullwhip. The mob faltered, turning in confusion. Pushing her way through the front rank of the men was a woman. She was old, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her back bent with age, but her eyes were as sharp and clear as a hawk's. She wore a man's heavy coat and carried a shotgun with an ease that spoke of long familiarity. It was Martha, a widow who owned a small, hard-scrabble ranch on the other side of the territory, a woman known for her sharp tongue and her lack of patience for fools. She planted herself in the snow between the mob and the cabin, turning to face the men, her shotgun held loosely but purposefully in the crook of her arm. "Silas, you worthless coyote!" she snapped, her voice cutting. "What in God's name do you think you are doing? Leading a pack of drunks to burn a man's home? Have you no shame?" "This ain't your business, Martha," Silas snarled, gesturing with his torch. "He is harboring a fugitive. He is an abomination." Martha let out a short, harsh laugh. "An abomination? I will tell you about this man. 5 years ago, when the creek flooded and my cabin was washed out. Who was it that spent 3 days pulling my belongings from the mud and helping me rebuild my foundation? It was not you, Silas, nor you, Jeb. It was him." She pointed a bony finger at Elias. "He did not ask for payment. He did not ask for thanks. He saw a neighbor in need, and he helped, which is more than I can say for this sorry lot of vigilantes." She swept her gaze over the faces in the crowd, her eyes filled with a withering contempt. "You call him trash because he loved a Lakota woman. Her people were on this land long before any of us. You condemn him for protecting this girl? She looks more terrified of you than anyone. Look at yourselves. A dozen armed men, come to burn out one man and a woman. You are not righteous. You are cowards." A shamefaced silence fell over the men. They shuffled their feet, their eyes dropping to the snow. The fire of their mob anger, so hot just moments before, was being extinguished by the cold water of Martha's truth. They were not brave men cleansing the land. They were a pack of bullies, and an old woman with a shotgun had just made them see it. One by one, they began to drift away. Their torches were dropped into the snow, hissing out one by one. Soon, only Silas, the bounty hunter, was left, his face a mask of thwarted rage. He gave Elias and Clara one last look of pure hatred, then turned and stomped back into the woods. They were gone. The threat had vanished into the gray dawn. For a long moment, Elias and Clara did not move. They stood on the porch, the rifles still in their hands, listening to the silence. Then, as one, the strength seemed to drain out of them. The rifles clattered to the wooden porch. They fell into each other's arms, clinging to one another, their bodies shaking with the violent aftershocks of terror and relief. He held her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, his eyes drinking her in as if he was afraid she might disappear. "It is over," he whispered. "For now," she breathed. He looked around at the valley, at the silent, snow-covered trees, at the cabin with its scarred doorframe. He looked at her, at the soot on her face and the raw, blistered hands that had dug a trench to defend their home. "If you will stay," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was deeper than love, a combination of awe and reverence. "We build a home here. We build it so strong nothing can ever tear it down." He paused, his gaze holding hers, giving her the one thing no one else ever had, a choice. "If you want to run, I will follow you to the end of the earth. Just tell me. Clara, stay or run?" Clara chose to stay. The word was not a shout, not a declaration, but a quiet, simple breath that remade the world. Stay. Spring came to the High Valley not as a gentle guest, but as a raw and powerful force. The snow, which had been their jailer and their shield, receded with a sigh, weeping into the thirsty earth. The sound of the valley, for so long muffled and silent, returned. It was the sound of water, a constant, joyful trickling from every rock and ravine, the roar of the creek as it broke free of its icy prison, and the low, contented murmur of a world waking from a long, hard sleep. The sun, once a distant, pale coin, now had a real warmth to it. It touched the south-facing slopes first, and a faint, tender green blush appeared on the land, as if the earth itself were blushing at the new attention. The air, once sharp and sterile, now carried the rich, complex scent of damp soil, of rotting leaves, and the first, faint perfume of pine sap warming in the sun. Life returned to the rhythm of the sun. They rose with its first light and worked until its last. The porch Elias had started was the first thing they finished. It was a simple, sturdy thing, but it changed the face of the cabin. It was no longer just a shelter, a fortress against the world. It was a home that looked outward, a place to sit and watch the changing light, a place that welcomed the world instead of hiding from it. Beside the cabin, in a patch of ground that caught the morning sun, they planted a garden. The earth was rocky and stubborn. They worked for days, clearing stones, turning the heavy soil with the one spade in their bare hands. It was hard, punishing work, but it was a shared labor that felt more like a sacrament. Elias, whose hands were made for the raw power of an axe, showed Clara the delicate patience of planting. He taught her how to press the tiny seeds, beans, squash, and hardy greens, into the soil. Not too deep, not too shallow. She, who had been raised to believe that dirt was something to be washed away, found a deep, grounding peace in the feel of the cool, dark earth on her hands. This was not a task of survival, but an act of faith. It was a belief in tomorrow, a belief that they would be here to see these seeds sprout, to watch them grow, to harvest what they had sown with their own hands. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Clara sat on the steps of their new porch with a piece of paper and a small nub of pencil she had found in an old tin. Elias was down by the creek, watering the horses, his quiet, steady presence a comfort at the edge of her vision. She began to write. The words came slowly at first, then in a steady, determined flow. It was a letter to a ghost, the ghost of the girl she had been. To the Clara May who hides behind the parlor door, she wrote, "I know you are afraid. I know the world feels like a collection of locked rooms, and you have been given the key to none of them. You believe what Father has told you. You believe that to be good is to be silent, to be obedient, to be clean. You believe that your worth is a fragile thing, a piece of fine china that can be shattered by a single misstep, a single impure thought. You believe that love is a transaction, a duty performed in exchange for protection and a place in God's grace. I am writing to tell you that you are wrong. Not wrong to be afraid. The world is indeed a dangerous place, but wrong about where the danger lies. The true danger is not in the mud, or the storm, or the hard judgment of others. The true danger is in believing that you are breakable. You are not china. You are an old, tough root, the kind that can split a rock to find the sun. You will be torn from the only soil you have ever known. You will be bruised and shamed and called ruined by the very man who taught you the meaning of the word. You will run until your feet bleed and your soul is worn thin. You will be so hungry you will thank God for a piece of gamey, unsalted meat. You will be so cold you will forget the feeling of warmth. You will hold a rifle and fire it to save a man's life. You will dig a trench with your bare hands. You will face down a mob of angry men, and you will not flinch. And through it all, you will not be ruined. You will be remade. You will learn that your hands are not just for playing hymns, but for building, for healing, for holding on. You will learn that your voice is not just for singing in the choir, but for shouting your truth into the wind. You will learn that love is not a duty. It is a wild and holy thing, a fire in the deep of winter, a quiet hand in the dark. It is a choice, made every day, to stand by another's soul, not in spite of their scars, but because of them. So do not be afraid, little ghost. Your journey will be a hard one, but it will lead you home, not to a house with polished floors and starched curtains, but to a place where you can finally be whole. She did not sign it. She folded the paper into a small, tight square. She walked to the fire pit, where the embers from their dinner still glowed. She knelt and pushed the letter into the heart of the embers. She watched as the edges curled and blackened, as the words turned to ash and smoke and rose into the vast, twilight sky. She was not destroying a memory. She was setting it free. A month later, Martha, the old rancher, made the long ride up to their valley. She brought with her a small supply of salt and a new quietness in her shrewd eyes. Tied to the back of her mule was a small, silent boy of about 10 years, with eyes that were too old for his face and a body as thin as a willow switch. "His name is Tom," Martha said, her voice gruff as she dismounted. "His folks died in that fire at the saloon a few weeks back. He has no one. The town, it is no place for a boy like him. They will work him to death or turn him mean." She looked from Elias to Clara. "I thought of you. I thought, perhaps, you had a bit of space here, a bit of quiet." It was not a question. It was a delivery. The boy stood by the mule, his gaze fixed on the ground, a bundle of all his worldly possessions clutched in one hand. He looked like a sapling that had been scorched by a fire, still standing but with all the life gone out of its leaves. Clara looked at Elias. She saw in his eyes the flicker of an old, deep pain, a child, a boy. But she also saw something else, a quiet sense of duty, a recognition. Clara knelt in front of the boy. She did not touch him. She did not ask him questions. She just looked at him with a gentle, patient kindness. "You must be hungry. Tom," she said softly, "I have a fresh stew on the fire." They did not treat him as a son. That would have been a lie, a weight too heavy for any of them to bear. They did not try to replace what he had lost, or what Elias had lost. They simply made a space for him. They gave him a bedroll in the corner of the main room, a place at their table, and chores that were simple and grounding. They gave him food and a place to sleep. And most importantly, they gave him their silence. They let him be. They understood, in a way the bustling, noisy town never could, that some wounds need quiet and time to heal. They were not offering him a new family. They were offering him a sanctuary, a promise to do good with the life they had been given. The evenings grew warmer. They would sit on the new porch, the three of them, and watch the stars begin to appear in the deep purple sky. The boy would whittle a piece of wood. Clara would mend. And Elias, slowly, hesitantly at first, began to speak again in the language of his past. It started with a single word. He pointed to the sky, to the first star of the evening. Wichapi, he said, his voice soft. It means star. It was a different word from the one on the locket, a more general term, but the meaning was clear. He was opening a door. Clara leaned forward, her heart aching with a tender love for this man. Say it again, she whispered. He did, and she repeated it, her tongue clumsy around the unfamiliar sounds. He taught her the word for fire, Feta for water, Memnai for earth, Maka. They were simple, elemental words, the building blocks of the world. For Elias, it was a reclaiming of a part of himself he had tried to bury. For Clara, it was the deepest act of love she could imagine, learning the language of his heart, of his grief, so that he would never have to be alone in it again. The boy, Tom, would listen, his hands still but his eyes wide, absorbing the quiet lessons. One evening, as the last of the light bled from the sky, Elias sat on the porch steps, turning his old, sharp skinning knife over and over in his hands. Clara watched him, a quiet anticipation settling over her. He stood up and went to the doorpost, the one that faced the setting sun. His lost lover's name was still there, carved into the wood years ago. Wiyaka. The letters were faded, weathered by sun and snow, softened by time. They were a part of the cabin's story, a part of his. He did not touch them. Instead, just beside it, he began to carve. The knife moved with a slow, deliberate grace. The wood curled away in fragrant, pale ribbons. He carved 4 letters, simple and strong. Clara. He did not place her name over the old one. He did not try to erase the past. He placed her name alongside it. It was not a replacement. It was an addition, a testament that the heart, even one that has been shattered, is large enough to hold more than one great love. It was a sign of acceptance, not forgetting. Clara stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder, tears tracking silently down her face as she watched him carve her story into the heart of their home. They married in the late summer, when the valley was lush and green, and the air was sweet with the smell of wildflowers. There was no preacher, no church, no piece of paper from the law. The town and its judgments had no place here. Their union was a thing of the wilderness, as wild and honest as the land itself. Their witnesses were the silent, ancient peaks, the sighing wind in the pine trees, and the crackling fire they built in a circle of stones in the field behind the cabin. Tom, quiet and solemn, stood beside them. They wore their simple, everyday clothes. Elias took her hands in his. They were rough, calloused hands, hands that had known violence and hard labor, but their touch was her only creed. I have no words from a book, he said, his voice low and steady, his gray eyes holding hers. Only this, I was a ghost. You brought me back to life. I will not run again. My feet are planted in this earth, with you. I am yours, Clara, all that I am, and all that I was. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. I was a prisoner, she said, her voice thick but clear. And you showed me what it is to be free. I will stand with you. I will fight with you. I will build with you. My heart is your home. Elias, it always will be. They sealed their vows not with a ring, but with a long, slow kiss that tasted of wood smoke and a future they would build together. Later that night, in the cabin, the firelight cast a warm, gentle glow. Tom was asleep in his corner, a picture of peace. For the first time since she had fled Missouri, Clara trembled. It was not a tremble of fear, but of a deep, profound vulnerability. She was standing on the precipice of a happiness so immense it was terrifying. Elias saw it. He came to her and held her, his touch gentle, questioning. "I am not afraid," she whispered, her voice a little shaky. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the firelight, filled with a love that was as vast and as deep as the Wyoming sky. "I am not afraid of the hurt anymore, not if it is with you." He lifted her into his arms and carried her to their bed. Their coming together was a quiet, tender thing, a prayer, a homecoming. It was the final, gentle healing of two souls who had found in each other the thing they had both thought was lost forever. The last scene was not an ending, but a beginning. It was a clear, cold night, weeks later. The moon was a silver sliver, and the sky was a black velvet cloth so saturated with stars it seemed to buckle under their weight. The Milky Way was a shimmering, celestial river overhead. They were in the meadow, the place where they had made their vows. The fire was a circle of embers, pulsing like a sleeping heart, and they were dancing, barefoot on the cool, damp earth. They moved in a slow, easy circle, his arms around her waist, her head resting on his chest. There was no music but the whisper of the wind and the distant cry of a night bird. They did not speak. They did not need to. They danced under the vast, silent audience of the stars. Two small figures in an immense landscape. They were a part of it, of the wildness, of the beauty, of the fierce, unyielding strength of the land. The past was not erased. Its scars were still there, on his hands, on her heart, carved into the doorpost of their home. But here, in this moment, held in each other's arms, under the infinite starry sky, it was forgiven. Thank you for listening to our story, and we encourage you to comment where you are listening from so you can connect with other listeners. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.